This is live from Lodi Garden, a conversation about the world, sitting in a 15th century garden in New Delhi, the capital of India. Your host is the award-winning historian, Hindol Sengupta.
Hello, this is live from Lodi Garden. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Well, we're not inside Lodi Garden today because it's raining outside. So we've moved inside a house which is very close to Lodi Garden. My guest today is the former Foreign Secretary of India, Kanwal Sibal. Mr. Sibal, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
I want to begin by asking you, let's talk a bit about what's happening with the Khalistan movement around the world. It's got renewed. Amritpal Singh is on the run. But I especially want to focus on what's happening in different countries, whether it's the UK or, of course, some parts of the US, recently Australia. How is the Khalistan movement coming to boil in all of these countries simultaneously?
Because there's a lot of migration of Sikhs from Punjab to these countries. And they are really alienated from their roots. They don't have any clear understanding of developments in Punjab. I've experienced this myself. I was seeing a rally in London near Trafalgar Square, led by Nihangs, barefoot, holding swords and stuff. And one little girl, not little, she came out for some reason, and I spoke to her. I said, well, what's your problem? I mean, the Sikhs are ruling in Punjab, the Kalis are ruling in Punjab then. There is self-rule. So why are you saying that the Sikh government, the Akali government in Punjab is discriminating against the Sikhs? I mean, you should have better understanding of what's happening on the ground. But she was very sure about what she was saying. They've been drilled with this propaganda by TV channels in the Gurdwaras that they control. And they have this narrative that Sikhs, Qawm is in danger, is being discriminated against. And they hark back to the 1984 riots. So they have a particular narrative. That's one side of it. The other, of course, is that in all the countries that you mentioned, US, UK, Canada, or Australia, these are Anglo-Saxon countries with a history of connections with India, not so much in the case of Canada and Australia. But nevertheless, they're part of the Anglo-Saxon world. And their media takes the cue from British and US media. I mean, the Australian media and the Canadian media. And there's a particular narrative that the BJP government, Modi government is discriminating against minorities, persecuting them. And this narrative, when it is promoted by New York Times or Washington Post or Financial Times or Economist or The Independent or Le Monde in France, this has resonance. Because most people would not want to, unless they are dealing with the subject as specialists, would not want to spend their time trying to understand the complexities of India. So they are given something which is ready-made, which reflects the viewpoint of the Anglo-Saxon countries. And since these are journals which are respected, so this narrative is bought by many people thoughtlessly. And that accounts for a lot of negative image that we have about backsliding of democracy and this and that. And this then exploited by the Khalistani gangs and all, to say that, since India is maltreating minorities, we are a minority, so we are being maltreated. So this gets a degree of credibility among certain circles. And of course, don't forget that there are always intelligence agencies which would want to leverage to the extent that they can such forces in order to maintain a degree of pressure on India in this case. But I would go beyond intelligence agencies. I would talk about the establishment as a whole, especially in Britain. Because there, as you know, Britain has a history of a particular kind of relationship with the Sikhs. They've always tried to separate the Sikhs from Hindus, push them through various means rewriting of history, um, sow divisions of various kinds, to push them to believe that they are not Hindus. And this kind of narrative has been bought by extremist sections amongst the Sikhs. Then there are parliamentarians of Sikh origin also, but not necessarily, who are dependent on Sikh votes. And they raise these issues in the parliament. I've seen on television raising these
including
issues.
Jagmeet Singh, who's not welcome anymore in India from Canada.
And then beyond all that, of course, is Pakistan and the ISI. Now, in Britain, for example, the people of Pakistani origin are very considerable. And there are people in the House of Lords and in Parliament and this and that. And they combine their efforts with the Khalistanis. And we know that the Pakistani ISI is sheltering well-known Khalistani extremists in Pakistan itself. So it's all a combination of all these factors which lies behind the kind of movement that we see. It is a minority movement, but it gets a lot of coverage in India. I'm not sure whether it gets much coverage in these countries. But in India, because we are directly affected, and Punjab is a very sensitive issue, and we've seen in the case of Amritpal Singh how there was a semi-successful event, movement to once again sow the seeds of conflagration and terrorism in Punjab. So this gets a lot of amplification by our media, so it looks as if there's a massive movement going on abroad, which probably is not true, but nevertheless is something which also we can't ignore because of the realities of the ground in Punjab.
Some people also, looking at the situation closely, would argue that some of this has been triggered by two things. And one is, of course, India's much awaited decision to remove Article 370. And the other is India's refusal to sort of kowtow to the Western point of view in the Ukraine war. And in a sense, flaring off of these issues by many of the agencies and actors that you charted out is a response to India not following the line, so to speak, or following the lead on certain issues. Would you buy that?
Well, if you really look at Article 370, what is the interest of Britain or US or anybody else unless they want to maintain a pressure point on India?
Correct.
If US and others and Britain and others do something in various parts of the world, or especially internally, when it's a question of Scottish referendum, or I don't know if in Wales whether there's a separate movement, but especially Northern Ireland and all the Ulster issues, we are not involved in those. If they take certain decisions in that regard, how does it affect our lives? So I would reverse the argument, how the hell does it affect their lives in any way if we make a constitutional amendment, which is perfectly legitimate in terms of the Constitution itself, since this was a temporary provision.
Yeah.
And quite apart from that, there was a crying need to integrate Kashmir more and more into the Indian Union in view of the fact that it had become for many years a playground of foreign interests, backing Pakistan.
Of course.
And it was a very powerful pressure point on us through decades in the United Nations, for instance. And even more recently, China once again tried to bring the subject back to the UN Security Council. So there's bad faith in this. And that is one. Insofar as Ukraine is concerned, why will the West think that whatever grievances, grouses, geopolitical considerations that are there in their mind with regard to the management of the European security architecture is our problem? What is happening in Ukraine is the failure of managing properly a European security architecture post-1945. Post-1945, it could well have been a European security architecture which took into account Russia's security concerns. But then, the Cold War began, because Cold War was a struggle between one form of governance and another form of governance, one ideology and another ideology. And that got reflected in arms race and building of blocks. NATO on the one hand, Warsaw Pact on the other. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there was I know this myself, when Putin very much wanted Russia to be included in a larger European security architecture, he was rebuffed. And it's not as if the idea of a common European home is something new. Even President Charles de Gaulle spoke about Europe extending from the Urals to Lisbon, which later was extended by Putin and others from Vladivostok to Lisbon. In other words, make Eurasia as part of a larger European security architecture. But this was never something which was accepted by the United States and certain European countries, especially led by the Baltic states and Poland. Germany failed. Germany tried actually to build some kind of indirectly a security architecture based on very close economic cooperation between Germany and Russia, which explains what they now are saying is over-dependency of Germany on Russian oil and gas. But the thought behind was that you anchor Russia and Germany, the principal power in the European Union, in a broader European framework, which would give reason for both sides not to disturb peace. But NATO kept extending. And if you go back to Brzezinski, he was always clear in his mind that you have to wean away Ukraine from Russia as well as Belarus, especially Ukraine. If that happens, then Russia becomes a duchy of Muscovy. It's no longer a European power. So in this context, what do they expect us to do? Get into these battles? We can't advise them on what kind of European security architecture they should build, apart from telling them, for heaven's sake, the only way out is dialogue and diplomacy, talk to each other. But the West is now arming Ukraine more and more. Even the other day, yesterday, the IMF has given $15 billion they are going to give to Ukraine.
Though isn't it against IMF rules to give money like this to a country at war, from what I understand?
Absolutely, because it is a sinking. You give money when you can actually help build up an economy and ease the economic situation in the country. But this is a war zone. But they're doing it because they control these organizations. And then they go ahead and declare Putin a war criminal. Neither the United States nor Russia nor India are members of the ICC. It's a purely political decision. Can they at all imagine that they can arrest the president of Russia and put him on trial at The Hague? It's complete nonsense, but they're going down that road more and more. So in that context, India is very wise to stay away from this conflict, adopt as much of a neutral position as possible. If this upsets the West, so be it. But I think on the whole, at the governmental level, the West has accepted India's position largely. They may not be happy with it, but they have accepted it as a reality. And there is some understanding that at another level, India's relationship with Russia is very important.
I want to ask you, some people have speculated that the ICC ruling on President Putin, in a sense, muddies the water for India's G20 presidency. Do you buy that?
Yes, of course. Actually, if you look at what Blinken has said yesterday or the day before, that so long as in the G20 we can have agreement between the 18 minus 2, and even if there is no communique at the leaders level, it's all right. The G2 can continue functioning. So, number one. Number two, they are aghast at the fact that South Africa has invited Putin to attend the BRICS summit, as if South Africa is compelled because of this ICC decision not to invite Putin. And they say that 123 countries, and Putin can't travel to 123 countries, complete nonsense, I mean. In any case, insofar as European countries are concerned, Putin is not going to travel there. And he's going to travel wherever else he can. He's going to travel to Central Asia, he'll travel to China, he'll come to India for the SCO summit or for the G20 summit, let's see. And then, of course, the belief also is that the timing of it was suspicious just before Xi Jinping arrived in Moscow, in order to put China in further bad light, that is disregarding the China also not a member of the ICC, that is disregarding the will of the international community that Putin is a war criminal and must be tried. They're losing credibility by these kind of policies and initiatives.
Since you mentioned China and Russia, let me come to that question. The growing ties between China and Russia are seen by many as complicating India's own ties with Russia. India, of course, has very difficult ties with China. We're at logjam in the Indian Himalayas, and the conflict seems to, in a sense, become worse every day. But we have traditional ties with Russia, and of course, ties that have sustained through the Ukraine war. But this growing ties between Russia and China, in a sense, complicates the picture of India-Russia China. Is that correct? India-Russia ties.
This is one way of looking at it. But another way of looking at it would be from another perspective, that does our increasingly close ties with the United States and with Australia, with Canada, we are negotiating an FTA. With Britain, of course, we are negotiating an FTA, and we've got the roadmap for 2030. So if you reverse the argument, does it complicate our ties with Russia, or for that matter, even China, if you are part of the Quad and Indo-Pacific and everything else? I mean, it depends on what perspective you give to this. Unfortunately, we absorb the perspective of the West. If Russia and China are getting close together, then it's a problem for us. I was ambassador to, I was foreign secretary when the whole concept of RIC was developed, and we had the first meeting of Russia, India, and China on the margins of the United Nations. And the thinking behind it was very clear, that was a phase of US unilateralism, their attack, Iraq, and this and that. Even the French were talking about multipolarity at that time. And therefore, we needed these three major countries to come together and try and develop a counter to this kind of use of or abuse of power by United States, this policy of doing whatever they wish to do anywhere in the world, which was an issue. And therefore, the whole concept of multipolarity and this and that, there should be more consultation. The views of big countries like Russia, China, India should be taken into account, especially when it came to Asian affairs and stuff like that. Then, of course, the RIC got expanded into BRIC to begin with. And then it became BRICS with the addition of South Africa. Earlier, Brazil came in, and then South Africa came in. And the concept there was that let's have a transcontinental or multi-continental body, including Africa and Latin America, but with the same thing in mind, that these countries do not have enough say in global governance, in the membership of the UN Security Council and everything else. And the West does what it pleases. And its time has come when there should be greater role for developing countries and non-Western countries in what you today call the international order, if you like. So, point is that behind all this, there is a history. Now, at this point, it is a fact that if Russia and China come increasingly closer to each other, which is happening on the ground, why has this happened? If the United States says that both countries are our adversaries and identifies them as such, and is very clear in its policy declarations that their aim is to weaken Russia permanently, and in fact cause a regime change in Russia if possible, if there is military defeat of Russia. What would the Russian leadership do? If you don't buy oil from Russia, they'll sell it to China. It's the biggest importer of energy in the world. If you don't buy their raw materials and this and that, they'll sell it to China, which is hungry for raw materials to support their economy. And they'll look at India and Africa and other places where they can sell their raw materials. But coming back to China, they have pushed Russia into the arms of China more and more. And then the narrative is that it should be a problem for India. Okay, I come to that. It may be a bit of a problem for India in some senses. But the thing is, who has created this problem? So why should we then buy totally the narrative that is coming from the West that India should be worried? So when it comes to stronger strategic and military ties between Russia and China,
Yes.
It can be considered theoretically a problem for us, because in this Russia, India, China triangle, that Russia-China axis, if that becomes much stronger, and we have our problems with China, then in fact the India-Russia balancing part of that triangle gets weakened. That is a fact. Because Russia then has to take Chinese concerns more into account than they might have done it otherwise. And that is very clear from the position they have taken on Quad and on the Indo-Pacific, which they oppose. But they also have concerns independent of this, because they think that it's also directed at Russia, but Russia also is an Asian power. They have their in Vladivostok, their naval fleet. That is their access to the sea there. And Japan is an ally of the United States, and now Japan is becoming more and more ready to increase their defense profile. So Russia now begins to see Quad and the Indo-Pacific in a somewhat different light, not entirely related to the confrontation with China, but also with Russia potentially. And if Russia and China are together, and with AUKUS and everything happening, and the NATO Secretary General going to Tokyo and saying NATO should have a role in the Indo-Pacific, and the British Truss also said that NATO should have a role in the Indo-Pacific. So it increases their concerns. But let me come to the nub of the issue. Whatever is being said, because this is a way to humiliate Russia, that it has become a vassal of China, is nonsense. It will not be a vassal of any country. It's the largest country on the globe. It's a tremendous military power, the real military power. Self-sufficient in raw materials, in water, in oil, gas, in food, and everything else. Yes, they would need the rest of the world to be able to raise their standards of living and become a bigger economy. But push comes to shove, they can far easily survive as an autonomous country than and they have a huge technology base which they have neglected. But they can go back to it. But anyway, that's a Russian problem. Russia will not be a vassal. And number two, Russia will take a neutral position on India-China issues. And if you look at it in a more sophisticated way, Russia, they may not say it openly, but would come to the conclusion that in the imbalance that is being created in Russia-China relationship because of the fulgurant rise of China, they need Russia to balance it. So while we also need Russia to balance China, Russia today needs India also to balance China. Otherwise, they have fewer options left. Why did they give us in the past the nuclear propulsion technology, leased us nuclear submarines, giving us S-400s and stuff like that, building up our armed forces? Why were they doing that? They're doing it because all this armament can be used against any adversary, including China. So this is also something that we have to keep in mind, that Russia will continue to support us militarily to the extent that we want to. And behind that is also a calculation that they also need space and they need a partner. And India is the most powerful partner for them in Asia. And so they will work at various levels in the SCO, RIC, BRICS. Everybody is together, but bilaterally they'll do things which may not entirely fit into the narrative that is being built up that the Russia-China relationship is a big problem for us. I don't think so.
I have two last questions. So, one of the things that worries a lot of people is in all of this, India-US relations were glorified for a long time, especially post-liberalization in India. Today, a lot of people are not exactly sure what are the dynamics, what's really happening there. Obviously, these two countries, there's a lot of talk about these two countries being natural allies, but there are all these dissonances. Where do you see India-US ties go from here? Do you think India-US ties will become even stronger? Do you think India will become a strategic partner of the US in the sense that its security, in a sense, will begin to get more intertwined with the US? Where do you see this relationship go?
It will definitely become stronger. There's no doubt about it. It is our biggest partner today, by far. And the levels and the range of interaction doesn't compare with any other country. The most advanced sectors of our economy are deeply tied to the United States.
Yes.
And if tomorrow these emerging and critical technologies are going to shape the balance of power in the world and the status of economies and the growth of economies, then again, India and the United States are absolutely critical partners. There may be other partners, but not on the scale that the United States can be our partner. United States and India have signed all the foundational agreements.
Yes.
We have become, in effect, close in defense terms. About $22 billion of arms have been bought from United States. The trade in goods and services has reached $162 billion, the biggest economic partner that we have. People-to-people ties are incomparable for 4.5 million Indians, but doing so well. Many of them are heading the most important US multinationals, and also now in the administration. Yeah. So the direction of the relationship is such that it will become closer and closer. On security side, they've been helping us in a limited way. We also don't want them to get involved beyond this. In Ladakh and elsewhere, they've been supplying us intelligence information, stuff like that. And they're giving us means to keep a tab on Chinese maritime intrusions into the Indian Ocean. That's also something that is happening on the ground, really. But there is no way that we can become, well, I put it differently. This does not mean that India is going to become an alliance partner of the United States. First of all, the United States wouldn't want that. Why would they? They have enough of a problem with China and Taiwan. And they don't want to have a conflict with China. They want to avoid it. They want to give Taiwan sufficient means to defend itself and create stronger alliances in the region as a kind of a deterrence to China. But look at their trade relations, $700 billion. In fact, it increased last year over the previous year. So there is this dependency. Japan's biggest partner is China. For that matter, even Germany's biggest partner is China. So there are far too many stakes involved. They're now going to take over the responsibility of helping us on the land frontier and put boots on the ground when they have retreated from Afghanistan. They're not going to do that. And our main and immediate problem with China is on the land frontiers, not in the Indian Ocean, which may happen in 5-10 years, but today it's not the case. And we have a certain edge there, even when China increases its presence in the Indian Ocean. But on the land frontier, we have an issue. We have an issue. And there we can't expect either United States or Europe or anybody else to come to our defense. So, in other words, there is no basis for an alliance as such. But yes, short of that alliance, whether it's Quad or Indo-Pacific or the help they give us in terms of ISR when we are dealing with China and the Ladakh and Arunachal and all that, that sort of a thing will continue, plus giving us technologies and platforms which help us to deal with the China threat.
How much of then, and this is the point I wanted to come to, if ties are as close as you explain them to be, and indeed they are, trade between the two countries are all-time high and consistently quarter after quarter. How much does this entire value-based narrative muddy the water? Because on one hand, ties are at an all-time high, all these things are happening that you explain, but consistently, whether it's questions on democracy, whether it's caste legislation, something or the other consistently brews, and this point about, oh, do we share values, constantly comes up, not just in the US, but in other parts of the Anglo-Saxon world too now. How much does that, create a problem?
Actually, I wanted to react earlier to that phrase which Bajpayee used at that time and which resonated a lot, that India and US are natural allies. Yes. It's okay if you want to posture, you can posture. But we've been a democracy since 1947. Actually, the only democracy in Asia in real terms. And then our entire structure of democracy is modeled on the West. But we are the countries, as a democracy, that was most sanctioned over decades by the United States of America and its partners, whether Britain or Japan or everybody else. And during the last phase, not the last 20, 30 years, who they chose over Indian democracy and China's totalitarianism or communism or whatever.
Or even Pakistan.
Autocracy. Yeah, that of course. They chose China. They chose China. Where were the values then? So there's no point in saying that we are the world's largest or the oldest democracy, this and that. Give one evidence where the fact that we are a democracy gave us some additional benefit which otherwise wouldn't have accrued to us. In fact, if we had been like China, a totalitarian state, suppressing the trade unions and labor and exploiting the peasantry and creating all these economic zones, they would have come to us gladly. I mean, I don't buy that narrative. That's one. The other is that this is the problem of dealing with the West. At the government level, for reasons of managing ties, geopolitics, responsibility in terms of governance. These Western countries can try and adjust their policies towards India, which, whatever they may feel about some aspects of Indian governance and management and democracy, can be put aside. Because larger national interest for policymakers is to look at India, which is a rising power, which will be the third largest economy by 2027, now they say, or 2030, and maybe the second largest in 2047 or whatever. Huge market, young population, tremendous scope for filling in the shortage of manpower because of aging of Western economies. So they're looking at all that. But there's a huge dichotomy between that and the media and think tanks and stuff like that, who then muddy the narrative by harping on backsliding of democracy, persecution of minorities, this wokeism that is getting around in the West, that is fueling all this. So sometimes I ask myself, how do these journalists, these big newspapers, see their role? Is it their role to create misunderstandings or to be bridges? Not in the sense of applauding and saying everything hunky-dory, but be objective, be reasonable where there's good. Mention that where there's not so good from your point of view. Actually, it's none of your business, but nevertheless, if you feel compelled because you think you have a vision where you must control the world, you can mention those things, but there's no objectivity. It's constantly. And that narrative is fed by our own opposition elements here, whether it's the political parties or activists or media or whatever. So there is a nexus between the two. And they come out with absolutely ridiculous things, where in the scale of happiness, Ukraine is more happy and Pakistan is more happy and Sri Lanka is more happy. Complete nonsense. But our press plays it up. I saw on television yesterday, in one of our channels, happiness index, and they must ignore this wretched thing. But anyway, I think this is a problem. The narrative is being shaped. it's very difficult for us to counter this narrative because we have people internal to our own system who have credibility abroad, who shape this narrative, who help shape this narrative. And Rahul Gandhi, when he went to Cambridge and when he spoke at that other think tank in London.
The LSE one?
No, that Chatham House.
Chatham House,
Chatham House, and when he spoke, he was saying the same thing. In fact, he was saying it more dramatically. Now, if a quasi-leader of the opposition in India says this, a lot of people will tend to believe it, that there must be some truth in it. So, yes, it's an issue, but there it is. We should, to the extent we can ignore it, we should ignore it. We should not be on the defensive. And we have to live with it. And it is up to the West and these countries to actually come to see whether this is helping them to build ties with us. Now, for example, they released this couple of days ago, a human rights report. If you read the chapter on India, short of genocide, everything in India which is despicable, which is a violation of human rights is happening. It's totally ridiculous. There is no objectivity in it at all. But you haven't asked me the question. There's one point I want to, which is important, which is relating to the UK and Khalistani movement and everything else.
Yes.
We should not get caught in the narrative that the only responsibility Britain has with regard to the Khalistani activists is to provide the mission security. Then we are playing their game. The issue is not this. Issue is, should they actually give legitimacy and space to people whose declared agenda is the breakup of India or challenge the sovereignty and territorial integrity of India? Now, if we have a roadmap 2030 where we are going to build a comprehensive strategic partnership, then can a strategic partnership be based on based on supporting forces which actually are doing just the opposite, strategically trying to weaken India by challenging its sovereignty and territorial integrity, knowing fully well that there are Pakistani elements in it, ISI elements in it, pro-Pakistan forces in Britain itself. They know the entire background. They know what is happening in Punjab, the history of terrorism in Punjab, yet they're doing it. So I think we shouldn't get caught in this narrative that if they provide a posse or policeman and this and then, the issue is no longer that. No, the issue is deeper and fundamental.
And there is a deeper issue, isn't there, sir? Because there is a history to this in the UK. In the 1990s, before 9/11, the UK had similar issues with France. You know, France used to complain about jihadi elements in the mosques of the UK, preaching a particularly virulent, form of, spiritual advice, so to speak, encouraging this kind of radicalism. And yet a lot of it was ignored until 9/11 happened. And then it, of course, exploded on everybody's faces. There are great similarities to that, or with what's happening today with the Khalistan movement. And even in the earlier period, in the 1980s, there were Khalistani elements that got shelter in the UK. Why do you think this happens in the UK?
Well, at that time, they were thinking that if they are soft on these elements, they will not target the UK. They will target whoever they want to target. It was an insurance policy that they bought. But that didn't quite work because there was a contradiction in it. If you participate in the Iraqi war and in the Libyan war and in the Syrian war, then you're laying yourself open to these extremists. That is one. The other is that, unlike in the case of the Khalistanis and all, perhaps they think that this is a safer bet because this is not a version of the pan-Islamic movement.
No, it's very focused towards it.
It's very focused, very limited. It is not against the West. It is against India. The other movements are against the West. So they think they can deal with it. And that's not so much of a danger to their own societies. That is one. The other is they feel that that at the end of the day, unlike in the case of Islamic terrorism, which has very deep roots and spreads across various countries. And they've had this dramatic events like the 9/11, and of course, all these things that we see, Charlie Hebdo, and the Bataclan massacres, and in Germany and in Sweden now as well. The scope of that issue is much deeper, much larger than the Khalistani movement. That's why they play with it a little bit, because it puts India on the defensive, gives them a point of pressure, and also helps them to derive electoral benefits from this internally in terms of their marginal constituencies or whatever it is.
I want to go to my last question now, but before that, I must mention one of the most ironical thing, and a lot of young people don't even know the backdrop of what happened in the 1980s, right? The Khalistan movement never asked for any region in Pakistani Punjab, including Lahore, which was the great capital of the Sikh kingdom. All the Khalistani maps are only about areas in India, including in Himachal Pradesh and so on and so forth, right up to Delhi. Which, of course, like you were saying, gives us a sense of where the money comes from, where the support comes from, what's going on there. But I want to move to the last question, and if you want to comment on this point also, of course, the rise of India. There is a feeling among many people, and this has been discussed in many forums of the West also, who wants another billion-strong country to become, $10 trillion economy, perhaps stronger than that, and have chart its own path in the world? Obviously, many people would want that country to be aligned in this way or that. Do you sense that as India tries to move towards, first a 5 and then to a $10 trillion economy, and there are some suggestions that once you get to $10 trillion, then, a lot of things get sorted. But this transition from where we are about $3 to $4 trillion to about $10 trillion, this rise will be a difficult period. And if indeed it will be a difficult period, what should India do? What are the few things we should keep in mind?
See, the thing is that Europe, if one talks about Europe, it needs external markets.
Yeah.
Their own population is dwindling. Yeah. So consumption levels are going to go down. Yeah. And managing their standards of living, unless they're able to earn a lot of revenues from exports and tie-ups with foreign countries, is going to be difficult. In the case of United States, the whole reason why they wanted a globalized world was to give a field to their multinational corporations to tie up all the global economies to service the U.S. economy with the huge advantage they had of a U.S. dollar as the reserve currency. Correct. So they never had to bother about balancing their budgets and stuff like that. And then, of course, tied up to linking the price to oil to dollar and everything else, the petrodollar part. So that particular project of theirs has backfired because China's rise has not actually met their expectations in terms of a more liberal model in China. And then China has gone ahead and very openly declared that by 2049, they want to be effectively the premier power in the world. They're challenging the United States. And then the United States is in their at their doorstep, not only in Taiwan, but the whole First Island chain, the military alliances, troops on the ground, this and that. So the rise of China was fine. They were deriving immense benefits from it until China started challenging their power and putting pressure on them in terms of managing their alliances in that region. Now, these problems are not there when it comes to India. And here, it's not because they value democracy. It is that our choice to be democratic suits them. And therefore, India's rise as a democratic power, and it will remain a democratic power because we are not following the same economic model and political model as China. There's no way that it can be done. Therefore, there is no threat of that kind that the West would feel with India's rise. On the other hand, it's a gold mine for them. The population now even slightly bigger than China.
Correct.
With a younger population and a huge market, consumption level low. If we rise to that kind of an economy, as we hope we will,
Yes.
look at the consumption level that will go up. Who will benefit from it? They, apart from our own population benefiting, they will greatly benefit from it. And therefore, they would have every interest to position themselves favorably in this geography so that they can maximize their gains later on. We are not a threatening partner. The other thing is that even though China and US and China were getting closer together, there was never that kind of a defense relationship. And it stopped after 1989, the Tiananmen Square business. Whereas with India, very close defense ties, which in itself then creates certain bonds which give a sense of comfort to each other and build a degree of trust. And then as you see, our entire economic agenda is westward oriented.
Yes.
And I include Australia in that.
It's
FTA
part
with
of the
Australia, with UAE, I'll include it in that. With Britain, with Canada, we are also negotiating some kind of a trade agreement with the United States. So the entire thing, and EU of course, is westward oriented. So they will derive a considerable benefit and comfort from this. So therefore, I would not look upon the rise of India as a problem for the West in the way that China.
But they would want a more
But
blind government.
there is one or two other things. One is that China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So that gives them a counter. They therefore are a counterweight to the West in the UN Security Council. And now with Russia together, they're even more of a counterweight. We are not a permanent member, and I don't think we'll be, in the time frame that we are talking, very doubtful that we'll be a permanent member either. So to that extent also, India is a somewhat safer partner. Now in terms of ensuring that India, because India is very clear, we are not bandwagoning with them, despite all the ties that we are building up. We take an independent position on Ukraine. We'll take independent position on other issues, there's no doubt about it. Point is that what is the kind of balance that they want to create in their own approach to India, between India not a threat and India being independent to a large extent in terms of its choices. Now, they can reason, if they were sensible, that India's choices would always be not against the fundamental security interests of the West. Our choices will be in favor of our interests.
Correct.
And if they have that clarity of mind, there ought not to be any problem.
Anything India should keep in mind as it tries to rise to 10 trillion?
Well, what we have to keep in mind is that the focus has to be on developing our autonomy. It's okay, you can talk about strategic autonomy, but strategic autonomy will come once you are a manufacturing power, once you have defense manufacturing, and once your economy continues to grow at 6, 7, 8% or whatever for the next 10 more years. Our focus has to be on that, and then leverage whatever relationship we can with every country to promote that ambition of ours. And this includes China. Mind you, in one sense, although at sometimes you feel emotionally not too happy with this, that China is a declared adversary, apart from Pakistan, the only country that vies for our territory, claims our territory, and confronting us. But you've seen how we're not closed the doors of negotiations with China, despite everything. Despite everything, because I think very wisely we are looking ahead. Moment we close the doors, we become more a prisoner of others. And therefore, even if you have a difficult phase, keep that door open, keep the others thinking that tomorrow India and China may be able to resolve their differences, and if they do, then the game plan changes. So therefore, let's continue to be sophisticated even in our approach towards China.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Sibal, for your time. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
You're watching live from Lodhi Garden. We, because of rains, of course, aren't in Lodhi Garden today, but we're very happy to have this wonderful conversation with Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, the former Foreign Secretary of India. I'm Hindol Sengupta. We'll be back with more very soon.
You are listening to Live from Lodhi Garden with Hindol Sengupta. This is a Global Order presentation, edited and produced by Koteshwar Rao and directed by Rishi Suri.